Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari-chan and welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Copper Coins Volume 2, also known as Tong Qian by Musu, and this is actually the final reading of Volume 2, covering chapters 26 and 27, so I hope you all enjoy, and let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Chapter 26, The Building in the Fog. The crescent bell rang urgently 5 times to signal that the chief diviner had reached their destination. They stood roughly in the center of the mountain depression. Surprisingly, the fog here was not as thick as it had appeared from the mountain peak. Instead, it was a thin layer, like the mist that rises from the ground on a rainy day, nothing like the smothering fog they had encountered earlier. In this translucent mist stood a small bamboo building, about 3 stories tall and exquisitely crafted. Perhaps because it had been shrouded in the fog for so long, every bamboo pole of the building gleamed with moisture, appearing clean and fresh. If not for the poisonous fog, it would have been an elegant and tranquil residence. The chief diviner and chief ritualist who had reached it first examined the small building from their horses. The rest of the group arrived and encircled the building. If not for their masks, their expressions would have revealed how grim they felt. Just finding this place had already cost several lives. Who could feel at ease in the aftermath? "Don't let your guard down. Even the slightest amount of fog is toxic," the chief diviner reminded the junzi. She exchanged a glance with the chief ritualist, and the two dismounted. With practiced ease, they placed paper talismans around the building, setting up a simple array. The moment the array was complete, the fog around the building dissipated, drawn toward the thicker fog outside. Only then did the court procession put away their sachets and dismount, following their leaders to inspect the area. They had come here to find someone. Who exactly? The junzi didn't know. They had only seen a portrait, but they had no idea what the person did or why they were looking for them. Only the chief diviner and chief ritualist knew the details. The chief ritualist glanced at the 3-story bamboo building and asked the chief diviner once more, "Are you sure it's here?" The chief diviner herself felt that this place was both an excellent hiding spot and a potential death trap. If the fog kept people out, it was perfect for concealment. But if it didn't, there would be no escape. She didn't answer. "Enough. Let's search the area first," the chief ritualist said, no longer asking questions. He quickly assigned tasks to the junzi. Soon, the 2 leaders and 5 junzi entered the bamboo building. They headed straight for the rooms inside. Outside, the remaining 100 or so members of the procession guarded the perimeter. The 3-story bamboo building wasn't particularly large, and the 7 of them quickly finished searching it. Well, the chief ritualist hurried down from the top floor. He held a scroll in his hand. He flipped through it, hoping to find something, but then shook his head and tossed it onto a wooden table. The chief diviner stood in the elegant and simple guest hall on the ground floor. "Nothing," she admitted. The chief ritualist crossed his arms and scanned the area before saying, "Lass, I'm not doubting your calculations, but could you have missed some clues that affected the results?" Faced with the facts, the chief diviner wasn't angered by the question. Instead, she sat down at the table, placed the grass knot and turtle shell on its surface, and began to examine them carefully. "Should we burn the shell again?" the ritualist asked. The chief diviner shook her head. "It would be no use. You can't burn the shell twice in one day for the same matter. Let me take another look." However, after a moment, she couldn't help but murmur a soft sound of confusion. What is it?" "Nothing. It's still the person I mentioned earlier. When I was doing my calculations, they happened to be in this town and were caught in the shell's patterns." The chief ritualist was utterly confused. The person you said couldn't possibly be here? Who exactly are you talking about? The chief diviner looked up at him, her dark eyes visible through the holes in her mask. They were filled with uncertainty. It must be someone with a similar birth chart or fate. It can't possibly be the one I'm thinking of. After all, stop beating around the bush. Who is it? Just say it. The chief diviner unfolded the thin paper stamped with the red seal and pointed at the characters. Tong Qian. The state preceptor. Who? The chief ritualist subconsciously reached for his ear, but stopped when he touched the edge of his mask. The state preceptor. No, that's impossible. The chief ritualist shook his head vigorously. The state preceptor is still at the top of Faelicy Temple. We saw him before we left. He's in seclusion. You know the rules. If he leaves midway, all his efforts will be wasted. Of course I do. That's why I said it's probably just someone with a similar fate. It can't possibly be him. But there's no but in this case. The chief ritualist waved his hand. Let's focus on our primary task. However, even as he said this, he couldn't shake a strange sense of discomfort. Just as the chief diviner turned her attention back to the turtle shell, a faint sound came from the distance, like something just brushing against bamboo leaves. At the same time, the grass knot on the table shifted slightly, as if blown by a breeze, changing its position. The chief diviner gathered her things and hurried out of the bamboo building. There was definitely a change, she said once she was outside. We need to leave this depression immediately. If we delay any longer, the person will escape. About 10 minutes later, another group of people stood at the crossroads where the procession of the court of imperial sacrifices had stopped. Which way should we go? The way that looks like a death trap, or that one, which looks clear and fog-free? Asked a short, stout man with a dejected expression. Of course, it was Xian and his companions. Since Jiang Shr-neeng's birthday was in 2 days, Xian didn't want to delay matters, so he left Jiang Shr-neeng behind at the Fang residence to spend more time with his sister. The rest, Loo Nee-ANNE-chee, Shitou Jahng, and Xuanmin, he brought along. Loo Nee-ANNE-chee was a human compass. Though his accuracy was hit or miss, still, he was useful for someone as directionally challenged as Xian. Shr-toe Zhang remembered the person who had kidnapped him, so he would be needed for identification if they found the culprit. And Xuanmin, whether he was useful or not, Xian felt he had to bring him along. He couldn't explain this impulse. Perhaps it was habit after they'd traveled together for so long. Not bringing him just felt odd. However, while he had followed his inexplicable urge to drag Xuanmin along with him, Xian now regretted it. After all, last night's incident still hung between them, and Xuanmin's mood had been off all day. Plus, what had Fang Cheng said earlier? Ah, yes, the effects of dragon saliva wouldn't wear off in just a day or two. Oh my. While Xian was mentally berating himself for being an idiot, Loo Nee-ANNE-chee pointed at the fog. Do you need to ask at a time like this? Obviously, we take the path that looks like certain death, he said dryly. Is this fog poisonous or not? Shr-toe Zhang asked. If it's certain death, how could it not be poisonous? Then how do we get through? We wade through it.
Huh, screw you!
Shr-toe Zhang almost turned around on the spot to run. What was even more eerie was that, on top of the woody scent, he caught a whiff of blood in the fog. Fresh blood, at that. His legs turned to jelly, and he wanted to burst into tears in front of Xian. Maybe that would evoke a shred of pity from the wise one. Fortunately, before Shr-toe Zhang could conjure any tears, Xuanmin spoke. His tone was indifferent. No need to panic. As he spoke, he reached for a paper talisman. His composed demeanor reassured Shr-toe Zhang somewhat. After all, Xuanmin was always reliable. If he said they could cross the fog, there was definitely a way to survive crossing the fog. At the sight of Xuanmin's talisman, Shr-toe Zhang knew he was about to set up an array. He sidestepped to avoid getting in the way and even tugged Loo Nee-ANNE-chee along with him. However, just as Xuanmin was about to use the talisman, Xian snapped out of his daydreams. In one swift movement, he pressed Xuanmin's hand back down. Such a trivial trick doesn't need a grand setup. Watch me handle it. Xian tilted his head and smirked. With that, he slapped the armrest on his chair. A faint crack echoed, and a fierce, howling wind swept by, like a raging dragon crossing a river. It brought with it an overwhelming force that surged forward. Whoosh! The dense fog that had lingered for who knew how many years was swept away like it had never been. Its absence revealed the old trees in the mountain depression, bent low to the ground, and a clear path. Xian turned to Xuanmin with his chin raised. Though he didn't say anything, his expression, which was mischievous as ever, somehow managed to convey a sense of, aren't you going to praise me? Xuanmin glanced down at him. The armrest of your chair is cracked. His tone was still a little salty. Xian thought that someone like Xuanmin, who couldn't read the room and always ruined the mood, deserved to be buried at the bottom of the ocean. With the thick white fog gone, things that had been hidden by the mist were now revealed. Xuanmin scanned the path and the half-withered grass on either side. Someone came here and then left. Xian snorted loudly in response.
Huh. Who says I can't be sarcastic too?
Shr-toe Jiang, who had overheard Xuanmin, was baffled. Had someone really come here? Why would an ordinary person come to a place like this? To seek death? Yet, as he spoke, he realized something else. Wait, they came and then left. They left alive? Anyone who managed to enter this place definitely didn't stumble onto it by accident, and anyone who could survive the fog unscathed was no ordinary person. Shr-toe Zhang clicked his tongue. Could there be another group looking for our target too? It seems like he's caused trouble for more than one party. But if they came in and went, it means they either settled their debt, took him away to settle their debt, or the person they were looking for wasn't here to begin with. Shr-toe Zhang wasn't stupid, and he loved to chatter. In just a short while, his mouth had done for the work of four, voicing everyone's thoughts. Xian turned to Loo Nee-ANNE-chee. He thought the dragon was going to ask if his divinations were accurate or tell him to redivine the changes, but just as Loo Nee-ANNE-chee was about to speak, Xian stopped looking his way. He instead seized a handful of wind and leaned back in his chair like a boss. The wheels of his chair started rolling down the path toward the depths of the mountain depression. In the blink of an eye, he was already dozens of feet away. His drawling voice drifted back to the others. Let's just search this place. If the person we seek really isn't here, we'll go after the group that left. A human only has 2 legs. Even if they're on horseback, that's only 2 more. How fast could they be? I could catch up to them even after a nap. Well, there was always someone who loved to show off and make things difficult for those stuck on the ground. Xian sped ahead alone. Aside from the overgrown weeds on either side of the path, there were no other obstacles. It seemed the fog had been the biggest barrier. In no time, he arrived at the 3-story bamboo building at the center of the mountain depression. Xian was the type who disliked relying on others, mainly because there were very few people capable of rendering him aid in the first place. Xuanmin was the only exception, but even he was just a mortal, and Xian still held his precious string of copper coins. So, naturally, Xian took the lead. His intention was to investigate the center of the depression first, then thoroughly search the rest of the area. If there were any traps or obstacles, he could deal with them to avoid future trouble. If the person they were looking for wasn't here, it would save those two-legged mortals the trouble of running back and forth. In short, his demeanor was carefree and unrestrained, and his aura was imposing. However, this damn bamboo building had 3 floors. The stairs twisted and turned, its bamboo planks were thin, and everything was interconnected. One wrong move and the whole thing could collapse. With all that in mind, someone used the wind to propel himself to the building's front, then effortlessly lifted his chair to the second-floor balcony in one smooth motion. He fully intended to continue this imposing momentum and enter the building to ransack it, but he realized the damn door was too narrow to fit his chair. To get in, he'd have to blow the door open. But if he did that, the entire building would probably collapse. He couldn't touch the door, nor could he move past it. In short, the damn door had been put there to piss him off. It was a blatant provocation. That was why, when Shr-toe Jahng and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee followed Xuanmin to the front of the building, they saw Xuan sitting blank-faced by the second-floor door. He had his head propped up with one hand. At Xuan's cold expression, Shr-toe Jahng asked, "What's wrong? Is our target really not here?" Xuan gave a frosty glare. Shr-toe Jahng, certain he'd said something wrong, covered his mouth. He hasn't started searching yet. Loo Nee-ANNE-chee was not afraid of Xuan's temper. Huh? Why not? Shr-toe Jangg's words were muffled behind his hand. Loo Nee-ANNE-chee didn't have time to answer before Xuanmin walked up the bamboo stairs to Xian. The other two said nothing more and scurried after him. Xuanmin didn't ask Xian why he was just sitting there. Instead, he walked through the 3 interconnected rooms on the second floor and then proceeded up the delicate stairs to the 3rd floor. Shr-toe Jahng and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee, not wanting to stand idly by or annoy Xian, followed. They turned the entire bamboo building inside out in record time. However, they found nothing. Not a trace of the person they were looking for. Not even a ghost. Xian watched them come and go in front of him. Though his face remained flat, he practically radiated irritation. "Really, there's nothing here," Shr-toe Jahng muttered. "No, he's here," Loo Nee-ANNE-chee insisted. As he spoke, a faint rustle of leaves came from the forest, and they all froze. Shr-toe Jahng peered into the depths of the forest. Could he be hiding in there and have taken the chance to run? Without the fog blocking the view, the forest was clear, and the sound was distinct enough to pinpoint its direction. After a moment, a pitch-black crow flew from the canopy. "Maybe the previous group had the same thought as you," Loo Nee-ANNE-chee said. "Huh? You mean they also searched the place and found nothing, then heard the sound in the forest and... that does make sense." Since he was a coward, Shr-toe Jahng was also neurotic. He could hear one thing and pull a whole string of related thoughts from it. "What you said made it sound like that bird is some kind of spirit that deliberately leads people away. Maybe it really is. Think about it. How could that bird stay in the forest with such thick fog? Could the fog really be non-toxic? No way. So the bird must be suspicious." Loo Nee-ANNE-chee didn't care to respond to his long ramble. He repeated his earlier words. "The person we're looking for is still here." "How do you know?" Shr-toe Jahng darted his eyes around the room. "Did you divine something else? When did you do it? I sure didn't see you." Loo Nee-ANNE-chee rubbed his ears as if to drive out Shr-toe Jangg's incessant buzzing. "I didn't divine anything. It's intuition." If someone else had mentioned intuition, Xian might have told them to get lost. But when someone with a spiritual constitution like Loo Nee-ANNE-chee spoke about intuition, it wasn't so easy to dismiss. "Use your intuition again," Xian said to him. "If that person is here, where in this building would they be?" Loo Nee-ANNE-chee blinked. Since when could intuition be summoned at will? Some people really took advantage of the fact that others didn't dare strike them when they were completely unreasonable. Loo Nee-ANNE-chee rolled his eyes in restrained frustration. After standing still for a moment, he pointed at a spot. "Here." He was pointing nowhere else but the room right next to Xian.
Just great. Stuck at the door again.
That room only contains a table, 2 chairs, and a wooden cabinet. To be honest, I never checked the drawers in the cabinet. There's no one there, Shitou grumbled. The inner chamber, Loo Nee-ANNE-chee said. The design of the bamboo building was quite unique. It was clearly the work of someone with refined taste. The first floor only had rooms on one side, while the other side was a platform supported by bamboo poles. The platform and the roof of the first floor rooms formed a large enough plane, upon which rested the second floor they were on now. However, the first floor rooms didn't have doors that could be accessed from the outside. You had to go up the stairs to the second floor platform, through the room next to Xian, and then go down the stairs inside to reach the first floor. The inner chamber Loo Nee-ANNE-chee mentioned was the one on the first floor. We've searched that room too, Shitou said. It just contains a bookshelf and a desk. I even shook out every book to see if someone was hiding inside. Xian tapped his fingers on the armrest. Then shake out the books again.
Young people these days, why do they love to joke around, especially when you can't scold or hit them?
Shitou groused to himself as he trailed behind Loo Nee-ANNE-chee into the room. Shitou was unable to resist a backward glance. If he hadn't known Xian's true identity, Shitou might have called him Little Brother Shr. But Xian was a dragon. Would he dare call him a brother? Calling him ancestor might have been suitably grand, but it would still feel strange. Jiang Shr-neeng called him Wise One, but that term carried a certain connotation. If someone not close to him used it, Xian would definitely give them a beating. As a result, every time Shitou wanted to address Xian, he gave up because he didn't know how. He wanted to ask Xian why he wasn't coming in, but looked to Xuanmin instead. Master, why aren't you joining us? It felt a bit ominous that only he and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee were moving forward, especially since Loo Nee-ANNE-chee was so certain that someone was still hiding downstairs. I'm coming, Xuanmin replied. He eyed Xian, who was sitting there doing nothing, before he bent down to pick him up. What are you doing? Having grown accustomed to moving at lightning speed, Xian was suddenly thrust back into the days of being carried around. He was so mad he could spit. Don't move, Xuanmin said in his recent saltier tone. He stepped into the room. Shitou's eyes widened. What? Xuanmin didn't reply. The chair got stuck outside the door and couldn't come in, Loo Nee-ANNE-chee interjected. Xian let out a cold laugh and imagined all the ways he could threaten the two of them for teasing him. Before he could say anything, though, he noticed something was off. Xuanmin was blazing hot, even hotter than he'd been last night. Yet his palms were as cool as always, and despite the heat, he wasn't sweating at all. His abnormal body temperature was clearly due to Xian's dragon saliva. Feeling a pang of guilt, Xian became more subdued. However, if Xuanmin's condition was caused by the dragon saliva, why was it presenting so differently from the night before? If Xuanmin hadn't been carrying Xian, he wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. The only possibility was that Xuanmin had used some method to suppress the effects, keeping all the influence contained within his body so that others wouldn't notice a thing. No wonder his tone had been off all day. Never mind saltiness. If Xian were that uncomfortable, he'd bury anyone who annoyed him in a mountain of salt. Now completely subdued, Xian obediently let Xuanmin carry him down the bamboo stairs to the first floor. As Shitou had said, the room was sparsely furnished, with only books and a desk. No chairs. Once Xuanmin entered the room, he set Xian down on the desk and turned to leave. The oil lamp on the desk was lit. Jahng had turned it on when they first entered. The yellowish light illuminated the small room, but there was no obvious place to hide anyone. Jahng and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee didn't bother flipping through the books again. They skipped the bookshelf and began feeling along the bamboo walls, looking for hidden mechanisms or secret rooms. Meanwhile, Xuanmin, while re-examining the bookshelf, casually pulled out a book and flipped through it, but as soon as he did, his hand froze. The book he had randomly picked contained some annotations, and the handwriting in it was unmistakable. The writing was lean and forceful, with distinctive connections between certain strokes that few could imitate. Xuanmin could tell at a glance the exact pressure that had gone into each curving stroke. It was his own handwriting. Anyone who suddenly saw their own handwriting in a completely unfamiliar place would be shocked. The faint-hearted might even find it eerie. Not a pleasant feeling, in any case. If this had been some ordinary place, it might not have been so bad. But this bamboo building was full of mysteries and ill omens. Few people would choose to live in a place surrounded by poisonous fog. Finding traces of himself here was deeply unnerving. Fortunately, the book itself was fairly mundane, just a written travelogue by an unknown author. The annotated passage was simple and described how the traveler had stumbled into a corpse shop in Langzhou to escape the rain and had encountered a corpse driver by coincidence. The annotation was even simpler, just 4 words: Langzhou, Xia Mountain. It was less of an annotation and more of a label. Xuanmin frowned, staring at the 4-character annotation for a long time. It wasn't until Xuan called out to him that he snapped out of his thoughts. The latter had been keeping an eye on Xuanmin while directing Shr-toe Jahng and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee. Seeing him frozen there with the book, he had to ask, "Bald donkey, why have you been standing there motionless for so long? Did you find something?" From his angle, Xuan could only see Xuanmin's profile. The dim oil lamp cast deep shadows under his brow, accentuating the contours of his eye sockets and nose bridge. This also made his expression appear unusually solemn, as if he'd seen a ghost. It was an odd look on Xuanmin, and it felt like a waste not to see it closer. Xuan called out to Xuanmin a couple more times. Xuanmin's gaze remained fixed on the page as he shook his head without looking up. "It's nothing." It was a reflexive dismissal. When Xuanmin glanced at Xuan, he paused in the middle of reaching for another book. In the end, he put the book down and walked over to the desk. Xuanmin had a unique aura, especially when he was doing something on his own. It was like the world had nothing to do with him, no matter how many people came and went around him. A sense of detachment and solitude, as if he existed in his own world. This solitude wasn't melancholic or wistful. It was distant and cold. Such a monk seemed more suitable to standing alone in an ancient snow-covered Zen temple, with a bronze and ebony pagoda behind him and the temple's heavy gates in front. Beyond its gates, the world bustled with worldly affairs. Within it, the monk stood amid clouds and snow. So, when Xuanmin dismissed him, Xuan thought it was as much as he expected, even though it left him somewhat uneasy. And then, when Xuanmin looked up, changed his mind, and walked over, it was as if the temple gates had opened from within. The simple sequence of events pleased Xuan for a reason he couldn't name. His good mood didn't last long. Xuanmin handed the book to Xuan and pointed to the annotated passage on the open page. Xuan examined the marked section and the annotations beside it, but saw nothing worth investigating, even after reading it twice. "Is there something wrong with the annotations?" "Okay, so what is it?" To Xuan's surprise, Xuanmin said calmly, "The handwriting is mine." For a moment, Xuan's heart skipped a beat, and his emotions grew troubled. On one hand, Xuanmin's unreserved attitude thrilled Xuan. On the other hand, why would something linked to Xuanmin appear out of nowhere? The person he was pursuing was closely linked to the one who had extracted his bones. In this vast world with countless places to hide, that person had chosen this obscure, fog-shrouded location. In the very same room, traces of Xuanmin had appeared. For a moment, ShooANNE stared at the handwriting of the page, his mind blank. His heart felt as if it had plunged into an icy river, sending a chill through his entire body. That settled it. ShooANNE silently exhaled, and the words on the page became clear again. "So what if you wrote it? Are you showing off your calligraphy skills?" ShooANNE scoffed. He flipped through a couple more pages. He said this purely to mask the suspicion that had arisen in him. Although he had quickly dismissed it, no one appreciated being suspected. Regardless of small matters, ShooANNE didn't want Xuanmin to feel any sort of rift forming between them. He slapped the book down in front of Xuanmin. "Compared to mine, it's still lacking." He gestured with his other hand, indicating a significant gap. "By this much." Shr-toe Jahng, who overheard this while searching the corners of the room, realized that there really were people in this world with no sense of shame. Truly astonishing. Even more shamelessly, the two most capable members of the party were lounging around while he, a middle-aged man, practically elderly, and a half-blind person, were left to search for clues in the room. To whom could he even complain about this? Xuanmin had been prepared for some kind of reaction from ShooANNE after revealing the book's secret to him, but he had never expected ShooANNE to respond like this. His calm gaze didn't waver, but he stared at ShooANNE for a long time. ShooANNE just sneered. "What can you deduce from one book? Call out and see if the room answers you." Seeing that ShooANNE was getting more and more unreasonable, Xuanmin averted his eyes and decided not to engage further. Just as he was about to turn back to the bookshelf to pull out a few more books, something did answer. A series of chaotic flapping sounds came from outside. They grew closer until a midnight blackbird flew into the room. Everyone was startled. ShooANNE almost summoned a gust of wind to blow the thing away, but on a second look, he realized it was just a bird that was black all over. The room they were in spanned 2 floors, so its ceiling was quite high. A bird that flew in wouldn't immediately collide with anyone. "Is that the bird from the forest?" Shr-toe Jahng asked as soon as he saw the black bird. It seemed like the one that had almost led them astray. With his exceptional eyesight, ShooANNE had sussed out the bird's appearance as it flew under the lamp's light. "Yes, it's the same one," he said with a nod. "But why did it come in?" At that point, the bird's actions shocked everyone in the room. It circled near the high ceiling twice, as if searching for someone. Soon, it found its target, swooped down, flapped its wings to slow its descent, and landed on Xuanmin's shoulder. It rubbed its downy face against Xuanmin's cheek and chirped a soft "Ying." Shr-toe Jahng had no words. Loo Nee-ANNE-chee, however, coldly remarked, "Crows don't sound like that." ShooANNE was probably the most speechless. He was eating crow for sure. He had said, "Call out and see if the room answers." And this stupid bird had done just that. Not only that, but it had also made such an odd sound. It even had the nerve to land on the bald donkey's shoulder and rub against his face, flapping its wings so hard that it sent feathers flying into ShooANNE's mouth. "Really, what nonsense is this?" Xuanmin was also surprised by the blackbird's actions, but when it obediently landed on his shoulder, he stopped in his tracks. Even without flipping through the books, he knew the answer. Birds were sensitive creatures. No bird would land on a stranger's shoulder and rub against their face. Shr-toe Jahng was unable to make sense of the situation. "What's going on?" ShooANNE eyed the stupid bird and snorted. "Isn't it obvious? This bird recognizes the bald donkey." "So," Shr-toe Jahng murmured. "So this house probably belongs to the monk," Loo Nee-ANNE-chee said. If Loo Nee-ANNE-chee and the others had seen the book Xuanmin was holding, they wouldn't have had any doubt. "This is your house," ShooANNE said, looking into Xuanmin's eyes. Xuanmin glanced at the black bird on his shoulder. He usually disliked people or things getting too close to him, but when the bird rubbed against him, He felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if he knew the sensation from a past life. He felt no disgust. In his heart, he had already concluded this house was his. Xuan stared at Xuanmin's eyes, and Xuanmin looked back without flinching. He acknowledged his statement with a calm, and he didn't look away, continuing to gaze quietly at Xuan. Whether it was an illusion or not, his eyes seemed heavy under the flickering light of the oil lamp, making Xuan feel as though Xuanmin cared about his reaction. Xuan averted his eyes. "That really is a stupid bird." The blackbird spread its wings and let out a cry, then pecked at him. "It even understands human speech. It really must be a spirit," Xuan said in a sour voice. "When you call out to the bald donkey, it's all soft and cooing, but when it comes to me, it's so harsh. Is that right? I think you don't want those shiny, smooth feathers of yours anymore." This evil spirit who'd lived for who knew how many centuries still had the nerve to pick fights with a bird. He actually reached out to pluck the bird's tail feathers. The bird unwillingly put up with him, let out a few harsh cries, and flapped to Xuanmin's other shoulder, putting some distance between itself and Xuan. Xuanmin stopped smiling and returned his attention to Xuanmin. "If this house is yours, then so be it. You're not the one who extracted my bones. I'm certain of that. But you might still have some link to that person. I hope you were enemies, not allies." Xuan's expression was cold as he spoke, and Xuanmin matched him. The atmosphere was so tense that Shr-toe Jahng didn't dare to breathe too loud in his corner, and even Loo Nee-ANNE-chee, who usually ignored others, felt uncomfortable. Xuan stared into Xuanmin's eyes, not missing a single flicker of emotion. If he wasn't mistaken, when he said that last sentence, Xuanmin's expression had briefly changed. The change was subtle and hard to discern, but at least it wasn't indifference. After traveling together for so long, if Xuanmin remained completely unmoved by the idea of being his enemy, it might have been time to part ways. Xuan felt a vague sense of unease. Nothing was wrong, yet something still felt missing. But now wasn't the time to dig deeper. He put away his half-serious, half-mocking expression and returned to his usual lazy demeanor. "With that face that looks like it finds everything filthy, I doubt you really could ever ally with anyone," he said. "The other party would probably be driven to madness. Stop brooding and check the corners and cracks. Since this is your house, your intuition should be sharper than anyone else's. Speak. Where's the secret?" He theatrically slapped the desk, fully playing the role of an interrogating jailer. The ability to change one's mood faster than flipping the pages of a book was something ordinary people couldn't handle. Xuanmin wasn't ordinary, and he still found himself somewhat flummoxed. He remained silent for a moment, until the spirit bird rubbed against his face again, let out a rough cry in Xuan's direction, and flew to a corner of the ceiling. It flapped its wings in the direction of a protruding bamboo joint. With a sudden click, the ground beneath their feet shook and began to sink straight down. There was another world beneath this room? Chapter 27. The Life-Sharing Spider. Xuan's hearing was extraordinary. As soon as they reached the bottom and the mechanism stopped, he heard faint breathing in a distant corner. However, the breathing was strange, so light it seemed on the verge of stopping, though it was steady and rhythmic. The breaths, light and slow, gasped 3 times before they ceased, leaving no further trace. Xuan frowned and pointed toward the corner. "That might be the person we're looking for. Why did the sound suddenly stop? Could they be dead?" Xuan's unlucky 2-wheeled cart was still outside the bamboo house, so he couldn't freely move at the moment. He could only sit on the table and watch as Xuanmin walked straight toward the direction Xuan had pointed. The oil lamp on the table had dimmed significantly since they sank into the underground, leaving only a tiny, weak flame that seemed like it might go out at any moment. It could not penetrate the deep darkness of the underground, but the faint light revealed that they were in a square stone chamber, about as wide as the room above. However, the small flame couldn't illuminate the far end of the room, so it was impossible to tell the full extent of the chamber's size. Xuanmin's figure disappeared into the darkness beyond the light. He walked in silence, as if he had been swallowed by shadows and left no trace. Xuanmin's heart tightened. It wasn't panic. After all, he had barely experienced such an emotion in his life. It was more like he'd sensed something strange. Suddenly, the sound of a mechanism rang out overhead again with a loud hum. Xuanmin's brow twitched. He whipped his head up in time to see a huge black shadow stretch across the empty space above. With a click, it sealed tightly and became the floor of the room above, and the ceiling of this underground stone chamber. If Shr-neeng hadn't lost his memory, Xuanmin would have wanted to ask, "Did you build this damn house just to mess with people? The exit is sealed before we could get out. What kind of joke is this?" If it weren't for the fact that this place belonged to Xuanmin, he would have already lifted the newly sealed ceiling. However, Xuanmin had been through a lot in his life. A single sealed ceiling, while annoying, wasn't that big a deal. Let it be sealed. Once they caught the person they were after, they could figure out how to lift the roof with minimal fuss. So he looked away, back into the darkness ahead. In that instant, he sensed that something else had gone awry. Something was missing. Yes, it was too quiet. Even Jiang's incessant chatter had stopped. No, wait. Where was Jiang? Xuanmin's brow furrowed as he scanned the area. There was no sign of any living creature within the reach of the light, let alone Jahng and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee. "Bald donkey!" Xuanmin called into the darkness ahead. "Jahng and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee are gone." For a moment, he even suspected that Xuanmin had disappeared as well. Fortunately, Xuanmin's calm voice came from the dark corner, though his words were anything but calming. "The person hiding here is also gone." Xuanmin's scowl deepened. "You didn't find them?" Xuanmin emerged from the darkness, dressed in white. He walked back to the table, picked up the oil lamp, and headed toward the corner where Xuanmin had heard the breathing. The flame of the oil lamp was indeed very weak. As Xuanmin walked, it gradually illuminated the path ahead. The light was minimal, only forming a circle at Xuanmin's feet, as if his robes were brushing it into existence. Meanwhile, the area where Xuanmin was seated grew darker and darker until it became pitch black. In the near total darkness, Xuanmin saw Xuanmin stop. His hand holding the oil lamp moved back and forth, lighting the area, the end of the stone chamber. Under Xuanmin's deliberate movements, both corners were clearly visible. Indeed, there was no one there. Xuanmin's hearing had never failed him before. He was certain that the breathing he'd heard earlier was definitely from this spot. No mistake about it. Moreover, based on the sound he'd heard, it'd been someone on the verge of death, much like the flickering flame on the brink of extinguishment within Xuanmin's grasp. Could such a person really have slipped away under his and Xuanmin's watch? Just moments ago, Xuanmin had been unsure of their situation. The ground had sunk too quickly, and his attention had been completely drawn to the breathing he'd heard, so he hadn't paid attention to Jahng and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee. He had even wondered if the two hadn't followed them down and were still outside. Now, even the hidden person was also missing. If he didn't realize something was wrong by this point, then his head was only good for making him taller. "Someone's playing tricks to avoid trouble," Xuanmin said, tilting his chin in Xuanmin's direction. "Have you checked that area carefully? Any clues?" Things sure were inconvenient without his wheelchair. He had to rely on others, and although he never doubted Xuanmin's abilities, sitting in the dark waiting for someone else to draw conclusions was frustrating. Xuanmin was not one to sit still. Without thinking, he flicked his sleeve at the edge of the table he was sitting on, and the entire wooden table hoisted into the air. Seconds later, Xuan, along with the table, landed beside Xuanmin with a heavy clang. Despite the loud noise, Xuan remained seated. The wind from the table's movements lifted Xuanmin's sleeve and subsided as Xuan landed, returning the stone chamber to silence. Xuanmin's lamp-lit face seemed surprised, but he said nothing. He examined the corner and the ground with the light, leaving out not even the smallest detail. Xuan pointed to a small spot in the corner, right against the seam of the wall. "There's a drop of blood there." Xuanmin took a closer look, then seemed to remember something and turned to shine the light on the corresponding corner. "There's one here too." He gestured at Xuan to wait a moment, then strode to the other corner with the lamp. After a quick glance, he turned back to Xuan in the darkness. "That person set up an array. So, when they couldn't escape, they started playing tricks. What kind of array is it?" He wasn't as knowledgeable about arrays as Xuanmin, since he rarely needed to use them. He couldn't determine what kind of array it was just based on a few drops of blood and their positions. That was something for the bald donkey to figure out. "It's not a dangerous array, just time-consuming," Xuanmin said. He returned with the lamp. "In such a small stone chamber, it probably can't be too dangerous. But what do you mean by time-consuming?" Xuan didn't look happy. "This array is called the 9 linked rings." Xuanmin placed the lamp back on the table. "There's no way to break it." "What do you mean, there's no way to break it? Are we just stuck here?" "Ordinary arrays have gates. Although the 8 gates are ever-changing, you can escape the array if you find the right one," Xuanmin explained. "But the 9 linked rings has no gates, and it doesn't depend on the trapped person's abilities. This array is often used to escape dangerous situations. It lasts for an hour, after which it collapses on its own." Xuan was almost amused. "If we wait an hour to get out, the duck we're after will have flown away." He didn't have the patience to waste an hour in this damned place. As he chuckled coldly, he raised his hand. "Wait." Seeing the dragon's expression, Xuanmin frowned and tried to stop him. Too late. In the small stone chamber, several purple-white lights flashed, each with immense power, and struck the walls of the chamber. The collision of the white light and the walls created deafening explosions, one after another. Clearly, Xuan was angry. Since the array had no gates, he planned to force his way out, blasting through until he created an opening. However, the 9 linked rings was a sinister array. The lightning bolts that shot around the chamber not only failed to create any openings, but also ignited fire. Crimson flames rolled over every spot struck by the lightning, and in a flash, the walls were covered in towering flames. The flames were long enough to almost lick at his and Xuanmin's sleeves. This wasn't the most annoying part. The worst was the heat rising from the flames on the walls. It quickly filled the entire stone chamber. If this continued, it would turn into an oven. For a moment, Xuan felt as if he had returned to the golden marble to roll around in the heat near Xuanmin's hip. A dragon like him, who often traveled with clouds and thunder, ascending to the heavens and diving into the seas, preferred coolness and water. He hated the kind of heat that made people sweat rivers. The table Xuan was sitting on shook a little as someone leaned against it. Amid that heat, he turned his head and saw Xuanmin, frowning with his eyes closed. One of his hands rested on the edge of the table. Oh no. The effects of the dragon saliva hadn't worn off. Xuanmin had been suppressing a body full of fire already. Now, with the external flames, it wasn't just unbearable. It could lead to the dispersion of his true essence, or even a chi deviation. Xuan instantly drew back his hand. The lightning bolts disappeared, and the flames on the walls subsided. Eventually, not even a trace of scorch marks remained on the walls. It was like nothing had happened. But of course, that wasn't the case. The flames were gone, but the heat still steamed around them. To make matters worse, the flickering flame of the oil lamp reached its end and went out with a hiss. The stone chamber plunged into complete darkness. In extreme darkness, in complete silence, the slightest sound was amplified. With his keen senses, Xuan found it particularly unbearable. Xuanmin's breathing was terribly clear in the darkness. The echoes bounced off the walls. Then they pressed against Xuan's ears like they intended to bury him alive. The heat made Xuan's mind go blank, and his reaction slowed. He couldn't withstand the continuous waves of heat and heavy breathing. He felt a layer of sweat form on his body, and his thin clothes started sticking to his skin. His temper rose. "What's going on?" "The 9 linked rings is true to its name." Xuanmin's low voice resonated in Xuan's ears. "Each time you try to break the array, the burden on the trapped person increases. It can stack up to 9 layers. In his muddled mind, Xuan thought that just 1 layer was already unbearable. If it stacked to 9, he and Xuanmin would be cooked. He bit his tongue, keeping his belly aching about why it had to be fire and not water to himself. He was worried about Xuanmin's condition. From the sound of his voice, he was in a bad state. They needed to find a way out. "At the very least, I need to help the bald donkey recover a bit." Xuan thought this through his confusion. But what could he do? The array couldn't be forced apart, and he didn't have any pills or tools to help. Wait. Something came through the fog in his mind. Since he was a true dragon, his entire body was a treasure. Anything he discarded was a priceless artifact to mortals. Unfortunately, he couldn't easily remove his dragon scales or horns in such a cramped space. If he transformed into his dragon form, Xuanmin would probably suffocate from the lack of space. Besides, even if he extracted those parts, they couldn't be directly consumed. They had to be ground into powder and made into medicine. Too troublesome. Other than dragon scales and horns, the only things that could be used to save someone were dragon saliva and dragon blood. Right, there was still blood. Sir, do you know of any side effects before you just go doing stuff like this? With the lesson from the dragon saliva fresh in his mind, Xuan didn't act recklessly this time. He raised his sweaty hand, groped around in the back, and patted Xuanmin when he found him. "Dragon blood. Would blood have any negative effects?" There was a moment of silence. "No," Xuanmin replied. "Then it's settled. I'll get some for you." Xuan had just exhaled a hot, heavy breath and was wondering where to make a cut when he heard Xuanmin give his own labored breath. "Really?" For a moment, Xuan was stunned. Before his heat-addled brain could process it, he felt Xuanmin's fingers grasp his chin. Without meaning to, Xuan moved his head in the direction of the finger's pressure, and something pressed against the side of his neck. Xuan's breath hitched. His hand at his side twitched, but didn't rise. It only gripped the edge of the table tighter. Something seemed on the verge of happening, and another strange feeling mushroomed in his muddled mind, but it never found an outlet. The sensation on his neck was so vivid it almost overshadowed everything else. Something was lightly pressing against his skin. With just a bit more force, in the blink of an eye, it would pierce through and press in. Wait. Abruptly, Xuan realized what was strange. Given Xuanmin's extremely disciplined nature, even in such a situation, he would only tell Xuan to stay away. He wouldn't agree to drink dragon's blood so easily, and certainly wouldn't choose to drink from the neck. The smoke haze cleared from Xuan's mind. His expression turned cold. With one hand, he swept the person in front of him away. He was naturally strong, and his sudden bursts of strength were often uncontrollable. If he shoved anyone aside, they would be smashed into the opposite wall and shatter it. Yet, there was no dull thud of a body hitting anything. Instead, the room filled with the sound of something like beads falling to the ground. Tap, tap. At that sound, everything around them dispersed like mist. The unbearable heat and the pitch-black darkness were all driven away. Xuan calmly scanned his surroundings. He was still sitting on the table, and the ceiling above was still open. The oil lamp on the table was still lit, and Xuanmin was beside him, with his eyes closed and his hands hanging by his sides. As for the missing persons, Shitou, Jahng, and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee, they were lying on the ground, unconscious. He had seen this before. They were trapped in some array and had yet to break free. Xuan chuckled coldly and turned to grab the dark corner. Immediately, a heavy object was dragged across the ground to rest in front of him. It was a person, a man slumped on the ground, dust-covered and disheveled, who reeked of blood. "First, tell me about the array you set up," Xuan said. He swiped 2 fingers up, and the man's chin lifted like someone was squeezing him by the throat. "Answer me. Have you touched the dragon's bones? After you answer, I'll give you a chance to bargain. You can pick how you'd prefer to die." The man's mouth frothed with blood, but even so, he managed a ragged smile. "What a pity," he said hoarsely. "Just a little longer, and it would have been done. But no matter. There are still 3 more. Xuan's expression turned frigid, and he raised his hand. You can't help them. The inner demons. You have to break free on your own. If even one is a little late." The man paused meaningfully, then let out a low laugh. As he laughed, he choked on more blood and coughed so hard his whole body curled up. Inner demons. Xuan frowned. He had heard of arrays that used inner demons to trap people. In fact, such arrays were often used in life-threatening situations, either when facing opponents far stronger than oneself or when surrounded by too many enemies. These arrays could buy some time to escape. They were also some of the few ways to defeat stronger opponents when outnumbered. After all, everyone had inner demons, desires, confusions, or at least some lingering thoughts, big or small, near or far. Some were convoluted and hidden deep in oneself, but the array could draw them out and amplify them until they disturbed the mind. Xuan felt his brow pulse upon hearing the words, inner demon. What haunted him wasn't the moment his tendons were ripped out on the coast of Huameng in Guangdong, nor was it the desire to make the person who did it pay in blood. What the illusion had conjured clearly was not linked to either of those things. Was it what just happened? What Xuanmin? He couldn't have been ensnared by the array just because he wanted to escape the stone chamber. If it wasn't because of those things, then it could only have been because of a person. And the only one in the illusion with him was Xuanmin. This was also why Loo Nee-ANNE-chee and Shr-toe Jahng had mysteriously disappeared, while Xuanmin remained. He was the inner demon the array had drawn out. Perhaps the inner demon hadn't been so strong, or perhaps the flaw had been too obvious to him, so he'd managed to break free. Xuan's expression changed several times before it settled into an icy calm. He tossed the dying man to the ground and wiped the bloodstains from his hands. The man was truly on the verge of death, but for whatever reason, he still clung to a sliver of hope. Although his eyes were unfocused, they held a trace of malevolence. "What are you plotting?" Xuan asked, remembering the man's earlier rambling. "If you confess now, I might let you live another hour. It won't take much effort for me to figure it out, but if you insist on being stubborn, I'll have to do it myself. Then you won't even get an hour." The man on the ground coughed violently. Each breath sounded like it might be his last. Xuan wondered if the person could still hear. Either way, He showed no intention of responding. He might have simply lacked the strength. Xuan wasn't surprised. He mentally unraveled the threads, trying to figure out what this man on the brink of death had clung to as he made his last stand. What could a dying man desire most? Nothing more than someone to save them or a way to escape. The former was unlikely in this situation. Even if someone came for him, they would have to get past Xuan first. With the delay, the man on the ground would die before leaving the room. The latter was a fantasy. If being rescued was no guarantee that he would survive, could he escape on his own? He was bound to die with things the way they were. How could he find his way out? Unless he had found some method to make his life last a little longer. Xuan's expression darkened. It seemed this man really was plotting to extend his life. Everyone had their own fate. If you brought yourself to the brink of death, you couldn't just tack on an additional stretch of life. So-called life extension usually came in two forms: exchanging lives or binding lives. The first involved using various methods to swap someone else's life for his own. Ultimately, one lived and one died. The second involved binding one's life to someone else's, so the two lived and died together. The first seemed more sinister, while the second seemed harmless. In reality, the second was dangerous, just less direct. The former traded lifespan for lifespan, while the latter traded fortune and blessings for lifespan. One divided lifespan, while the other divided fortune and blessings. It could also transfer misfortune, and there might have been other harms as well. In the end, the two methods were equally bad. Since this man was plotting to extend his life, there must have been someone whose life he intended to exchange with or bind. This matched the nonsense the bastard had been spouting earlier. No matter. There are still 3 more. Xuan felt a dark cloud looming over his head. He was not one to owe favors. This trait had its pros and cons. The good was that he had lived for so many years without any debts. He'd never owed anyone anything for long or gotten entangled with them. The bad was that, without connections or interactions, he had no close relationships. This might have been a disadvantage for ordinary people, but to Xuan, it seemed the most comfortable way to live. Still, regardless of whether they were close or not, Loo Nee-ANNE-chee and Shr-toe Jahng were people Xuan had brought along with him. In times like these, they could be considered his people, not to mention Xuanmin. To plot against his people right in front of him. This person really had a death wish. Xuan's eyes flickered as he recalled the sound he'd heard the moment he'd broken free from the inner demon. It was a sound like lightweight beads, lighter than gold or agate beads, and not as crisp, falling to the ground. Xuan suspected that was the key to the life extension. Time was running out, and he didn't have the patience to wait for the scoundrel to come to his senses and explain what he'd meant. Xuan remembered what Shr-toe Jahng had said earlier. This person had taken him to a mountain and watched him carve 7 stone locks and 2 tomb guardian beasts. Let me ask you, do you know about Funto Island in the middle of the river in Wolong County? There's a tomb chamber beneath it where over 300 restless souls were trapped, Xuan said coldly, grabbing the man again. Do you think those trapped souls would recognize you if they saw you? The coughing man hunched in on himself, as if he still feared the consequences of his misdeeds even in his near-death state. He gasped heavily a few times, like the memory was fighting him, and barely croaked out, Now you want to talk? Sorry, I've lost my patience. Xuan interrupted. He cocked his head to one side. Just wanted to confirm how to make you suffer. With that, he flipped his hand, and a set of iron tags with names carved into them appeared in his palm. The resentment of these trapped souls runs deep. Even if their remains were properly buried, it would take at least a decade for their grievances to dissipate. especially when they see their enemy. He lowered his voice and flickered his finger in the air. A red mark appeared on the dying man's forehead. He suddenly grew alert, as if he had been revived by a miracle. Suffering should be endured while awake, ShooANNE said. He scattered the iron tags onto the man. The tags were thin and no larger than a thumb, and there were no more than 20 or 30. They could easily have been brushed off, yet the man seemed crushed under the weight of a mountain. His body turned stiff and pressed against the ground, and he was unable to move no matter how much he struggled. Then, as if he had seen something terrible, the man's eyes widened. He let out a blood-curdling scream. "Ah! Go away! Don't come near me!" He screamed and screamed, his body writhing as he cried and begged for mercy. It was a complete, unrestrained breakdown. "Please, I beg you, ask me anything. Go away. Take them away. Make them leave." Perhaps this man's desperate cries were too piercing. Loo Nee-ANNE-chee and Jahng, who'd been lying on the ground, both twitched and woke up with a start, as if they'd hit the ground in their dreams. Plop, plop. Something else fell to the ground, twice in succession. Jahng gasped for breath. His eyes were unfocused as he stared into the void. It took him a while to snap back to reality. What happened? What just happened? How did I fall asleep in a place like this?" He looked at Loo Nee-ANNE-chee and saw that the aloof but reliable young man seemed to have just woken up as well. That made the situation even more bizarre. "Hey, Xiao-chee, did you have a dream too? What did you see?" Zhang asked. Loo Nee-ANNE-chee's face was pale, and he looked utterly lost. After a long pause, he said in a rough voice, "I saw Shr-ju, but it didn't quite feel like him." "Ha! Please! Please!" Before Loo Nee-ANNE-chee could finish his sentence, the man's frantic wails cut through the air again, scattering some of the lingering turmoil from the inner demons. "What's wrong with him?" Loo Nee-ANNE-chee asked ShooANNE, his voice full of suspicion. ShooANNE frowned and glanced at Xuanmin, who still showed no signs of movement, then back at the man on the ground. "I'll give you a moment to catch your breath," he said. He flicked his fingers. "Now, tell me again, what exactly did you do?" The agonizing pain of 100 ants gnawing at the man's body subsided. He gasped for breath, his face drenched in tears and snot. When he answered, it was in a weak, disjointed manner. "I can't die. I can't use life-sharing spider. The array." ShooANNE's eyes narrowed. "The life-sharing spider? How do we break it?" "The array. If the array is broken, the spider dies. If the array remains unbroken..." The man's unfocused eyes fixed on Shr-neeng. "Just a moment. Pierce the skin. Draw blood." When the man spoke, ShooANNE was already rummaging through Xuanmin's clothes, searching for something. "Leave a blood mark. Then..." "Found it." ShooANNE spotted a faint red dot forming on Xuanmin's neck. Without hesitation, he pulled aside the collar and instinctively pressed his lips to the mark, which resembled a bruise. "Sucking won't work. Once it's inside, it can't be sucked out," the man said. He had regained some strength, perhaps due to the lingering effects of ShooANNE's earlier conjuration. He even managed to speak coherently again. In a state of manic clarity, the man stared at Xuanmin's neck and ShooANNE, who was bent over it. His dull eyes flickered with a hint of madness. "It's done. It's useless now. It's already done. As long as the blood mark sprouts spider legs, I'll live again." He sighed and studied his own hands, which seemed to have regained some vitality. ShooANNE lifted his head and wiped a trace of blood from his downturned mouth. The skin around the blood mark was red from his sucking, but the mark itself remained, just as the scoundrel had said. In fact,
It seemed to be spreading, as if the spider legs were beginning to emerge. Just as a thin red line began to extend from the blood mark, Xuan froze. It looked familiar. He glanced at the red mole at the junction of Xuanmin's neck and jaw. Every time Xuanmin fell into a state of confusion, that mole would sprout several blood vessels, exactly like the life-sharing spider. The new blood mole on Xuanmin's neck abruptly stopped after extending 2 blood vessels. It began to retract, and eventually, the mole itself disappeared. Before Xuan could understand what had happened, he felt Xuanmin stir. He watched as Xuanmin slowly opened his eyes and shifted to look at him. "Awake?" Xuan asked. For a second, Xuanmin raised his hand just an inch. "We were tricked. We fell prey to an inner demon," Xuan continued. His expression was complex as he recalled what he'd seen earlier. He didn't notice Xuanmin's raised hand drop back down. The monk closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he was fully awake. He looked intently at Xuan. Xuan suddenly realized how compromising his position looked. The mark he'd left by sucking on Xuanmin's neck was still vivid on the skin. No. Let me explain." But the damned life-sharing spider had already vanished without a trace. Without evidence, what was there to explain? Whether Xuan managed to explain himself or not, Xuanmin was not the kind of person to react too strongly. He might even turn his face away to spare Xuan some embarrassment and pretend nothing had happened. As for what Xuanmin was really thinking, that was beyond Xuan's control. It would make little difference. Besides, Xuanmin had already paraded around in the inner demon. What was there to explain? So what if he left the mark? It wasn't like he could take it back now. Xuan's expression shifted through a myriad of emotions before he finally gave up and sat up straight, acting as if nothing had happened. He eyed Xuanmin as if accusing him of being the one at fault. "Why are you looking at me?" Xuanmin's body temperature was scorching, making the coolness of his neck all the more noticeable. Even though he hadn't seen what had happened, he reached up and touched the offending spot. Before Xuan could see any change in Xuanmin's face, the dragon guiltily turned away, hardening his expression, and sneered at the man on the ground. "Didn't you say it worked? How do you feel now? Because from where I'm sitting, you don't look like you're about to live." "I'm alive. I'm really alive. I can live," the man babbled. "Look, I can move my fingers now." As he spoke, he clenched his fists a few times. Indeed, he seemed to have regained some strength. Xuan's next words shattered his delusions. "Stop showing off those chicken claws of yours. Do you really think the strength comes from the life-sharing spider?" Xuan smirked crookedly. "I just needed you to stay conscious a little longer so you could suffer. Look." He tugged lightly at Xuanmin's collar without turning his head. "Your precious blood mark is gone, let alone any spider legs. You'd have better luck dreaming. Besides, if it had really worked, you wouldn't be the one lying on the ground shaking right now." At first, the man seemed unwilling to believe it, but when he processed the last part, he had no choice but to accept the truth. If his plan had really worked, wouldn't the difference between him and Xuanmin have been more obvious? The man went limp on the ground, his eyes wide, completely broken. "It seems your life-sharing spider can't compare to a flick of my finger," Xuan said. His tone was glacier cold. The man's wailing cut off. After going through so much, he finally seemed to accept reality. He crawled over and grabbed Xuan's foot, which was dangling off the table. "Save me, please, save me. I can't die. I shouldn't die. I was supposed to have a merit. How can I die?" Xuan was thoroughly disgusted by the man clinging to his foot, but his legs were numb. He couldn't pull away. Xuan turned to Xuanmin for help instead. "Bald donkey, could you—" Then he remembered his guilt and swallowed his words. He was prepared to resign himself to enduring the man's touch when Xuanmin moved. With a wave of his hand, the man clinging to Xueshan's leg was tossed a full 10 feet away, and Xueshan's leg was gently set back onto the table. Xueshan blinked in shock. Wait, I could have done that myself. Why did I freeze up at a critical moment? That's a great question. He blamed his temporary stupidity on the heat from the inner demon, which must have fried his brain. Now wasn't the time to dwell on that. There were more pressing matters. He leaned toward the man on the ground. What were you saying earlier? That you have merit. Have you asked those iron tags if they agree? You trapped 300 restless souls in a tomb, condemning them to eternal suffering. And you have the nerve to talk about merit. Your lordship doesn't understand. The man, desperate to live, suddenly switched to addressing Xueshan as lordship whenever he could, which just made Xueshan scowl. Your lordship really doesn't understand. The section of the river near Wolong County has always been treacherous, with hidden whirlpools and strong currents. If a major flood were to hit, both banks would be devastated, and countless lives would be lost. Next spring and summer, Wolong County will face a once-in-a-century flood. I set up the flow of 100 soldiers to prevent that disaster. The man looked up at Xueshan and patted at his own chest as he spoke. Saving hundreds, thousands, even millions of lives. Isn't that an act of great merit? How could I deserve to die? I should live to save more people from suffering. How do I deserve death when useless people are still alive? The tone chamber fell silent. Xuanmin's eyes flickered, as if he just remembered something, but he composed himself quickly. He frowned at the man on the ground. Xueshan remained expressionless for a moment before letting out a chilly laugh. Why do you deserve to die? Let me ask you this. Has the flood happened yet? Next spring and summer, the man repeated. He thought Xueshan was questioning the accuracy of the prediction, so he kept defending it. The person who divined this disaster is a master. He's never been wrong before. There's no way he Xueshan cut him off impatiently. Even if it's true, I'm asking you, has the flood happened yet? Have lives been lost? Not yet. The man shook his head, trying to speak again. But people have already died, Xueshan said, holding up 3 fingers. 300 people. The flood hasn't even arrived, but you've already claimed 300 souls. Not only did you deny them a peaceful life, but you also refused to let them rest in death. Did you even ask for their consent? Did they agree to be sacrificed for your so-called flow of 100 soldiers? There's always a price to pay for changing fate. 300 lives for millions. So it's a good deal, is that it? You treat human lives like commodities and weigh them on a scale. I understand, the man said, as if he still believed he had some conscience left. That's why I carefully selected beggars and disabled soldiers. Beggars spend their days on the streets, and they often die overnight from exposure. They're of little use compared to ordinary people. As for the disabled soldiers, they're already half dead, missing limbs, unable to work or make a living. They're just a burden. Xueshan was almost amused by the man's audacity. You know, I think you're a burden too, he said. Look at you now, lying there like a piece of rotten meat and barely clinging to life. How about this? I'm planning to set up an array of my own, and I only need 1 life. How about I use yours? Maybe in 100 years, I'll save millions of people. The man was speechless. Of course, Xueshan wasn't bored enough to save anyone, nor was he compassionate enough to lay any souls to rest. He was doing all this because, in his mind, dying without remorse or understanding of one's wrongdoings was a form of release. For someone like this man, it was more fitting to be denied that, and to die full of guilt and fear. But before that happened, there were still questions that needed to be answered. Let me ask you one more thing, Xueshan said. Where did the dragon bone buried in your tomb come from? It was a gift from a master. The bone made the array more effective, the man said cautiously. ShooANNE-Mean's patience was wearing thin. I hate it when people beat around the bush. How about I send you to the underworld right now, huh? No, I'll talk. The master, he's a sorcerer. I followed him for years. My blood is spiritually potent, far more effective for setting up arrays than ordinary methods. He's taught me many things. I've been with him since I was 8 or 9, studying for over a decade. So the preceptor? Anyway, he's really a master, though he forbade me from calling him that. He only gave me a peachwood waist pendant passed down among his disciples. Though I no longer follow him, we've stayed in contact. He warned me about the great flood coming to Wolong County's part of the river and helped me set up the flow of 100 soldiers with his men. A sorcerer again. ShooANNE recalled the sorcerer mentioned by Scribe Liu. It seemed they were one and the same. Since the dragon bone had come from him, this sorcerer was almost certainly the man they sought. To set up your array, you kidnapped 300 orphaned souls. To carve statues, you bound people to desolate mountains. To amplify your schemes, you buried a dragon bone. You and your shifu are cut from the same cloth. You're both vile to the core. ShooANNE jeered. What's your shifu's name? Having sensed that ShooANNE's true target was a shifu, the man tried to bargain. If you spare me for a few more years. Before he could finish, ShooANNE waved his sleeve and slammed the man against the wall. Then don't speak. I'll find him anyway. Song Yuan, the man gasped. His Taoist name is Song Yuan. That was what he needed. ShooANNE moved to strike, but Xuanmin pressed a hand to his wrist. What? I have questions, Xuanmin said coolly. He turned to the man. Have you seen him before? The question froze Shr-toe Jahng, Loo Nee-ANNE-chee, and even ShooANNE. Weak and wobbling, the man squinted at Xuanmin. He shook his head. No. Xuanmin frowned. Then why flee? The master foresaw that I'd face a calamity. He told me to head this way for a chance at salvation. I heard birdsong from outside the fog-covered forest, so I took an antidote and crept in. The blackbird saw me covered in blood and showed me the path. How did this bald donkey raise a bird that aids criminals? Yet ShooANNE felt an odd relief at hearing this. At least Xuanmin and the man shared no past. Another matter came to ShooANNE. He eyed Xuanmin's neck. Where did you get the life-sharing spider? From your sorcerer, Shifu? Yes. He said it came from Longzhou, the man admitted. He was unable to pinpoint ShooANNE's mood and too afraid to bargain further. Longzhou, ShooANNE repeated. He flipped through the book on the table with Xuanmin's annotations to find the words. Longzhou's Mount Xia. This wasn't the first time he'd heard of this place. Earlier, when discussing Xuanmin's amnesia back in the inn, the monk had mentioned waking in the mountains of Longzhou. Had the pre-amnesia Xuanmin discovered the life-sharing spider's secret and found a way to break the spell which had led him to Longzhou? Ultimately, their trip had been well worth it. Their previous jumble of disjointed clues had lined itself up and become clear. Everything now pointed to one person, the sorcerer, and one place, Longzhou. Having learned these two things, ShooANNE saw no reason to linger. He raised his hand and clenched his fist, leaving the resentful energy from the iron tags to engulf the man. The man screamed. ShooANNE watched impassively. With the curl of his finger, he drew a wisp of white smoke from the man's body. The spiritual energy he'd infused into the man to keep him conscious was no more. As the man wailed in agony, he sank back to the brink of death. Enveloped in resentment and feeling his end closing in, bit by bit, the man broke down again. Tears streamed down his face as regret coursed through him. He didn't want to die. What would you do? The words were vague and fragmented, but ShooANNE understood. If it were you who were faced with a flood, what would you do? Defying fate always came at a cost. ShooANNE watched the man in silence. He almost deigned to answer, but then he decided that this person was fundamentally different from him. The man wouldn't understand, no matter how ShooANNE explained. It would have been a waste of words. When the man's breath stilled at last, ShooANNE gathered the iron tags and turned to Xuanmin. "Have your bird flap us back up and out of here," ShooANNE demanded, extending his arms. It was a clear request to be carried, though from his tone, he sounded more like he was collecting a debt. Xuanmin stared back at ShooANNE. For some reason, the monk hesitated, though he eventually reached out and lifted ShooANNE off the table. ShooANNE didn't get it. Xuanmin usually acted like carrying him was no more than carrying a sack, so much so that he'd grown accustomed to it. Why the sudden hesitation? Had Xuanmin been affected by the inner demons? The answer hit ShooANNE when he was back in Xuanmin's arms. The monk's body temperature was even hotter than before, so hot that ShooANNE felt uncomfortable. Even the hand that had been cool earlier was now scalding. And why had this happened? Because when he nibbled on Xuanmin's neck, Xuanmin had come into contact with the dragon's saliva once again. What a pain. A single dose of dragon saliva was potent enough for the average person, but for someone like Xuanmin, it wasn't too bad. It just required some basic restraint. However, the effects of a second dose were doubled, and the average person would probably be pushed beyond the brink. Even Xuanmin had been drenched in sweat at night the last time it happened. And now, a third round. Though ShooANNE couldn't fully empathize with what Xuanmin was going through, he imagined that it was probably beyond what most people could endure. It might even be life-threatening. Xuanmin was still suppressing the effects of the dragon saliva within his body, but something was definitely going to blow. His body temperature alone was enough to burn someone to death. "Well, we have to find a way to deal with this nuisance, since the dragon saliva is mine." ShooANNE's conscience stirred as he wondered about a solution. He wasn't sure what to do, but whatever it was, it shouldn't be done in a crowded place. It was best to have no one around, as this wasn't something that was appropriate to discuss with others. "Since this house is heavily linked to you, don't you plan to search it top to bottom for clues about your past?" he asked Xuanmin. Xuanmin had planned on doing so he made a low hum of agreement. ShooANNE nodded at Shr-toe, Jahng, and Loo Nee-ANNE-chee. "You two head back first, lest Jiang, Shr-neeng, and the others worry. The bald donkey and I will go through this little pagoda again." With his poor eyesight, Loo Nee-ANNE-chee made no objection, but Shr-toe, Jahng hesitated. He wanted to stay and help because this little pagoda wasn't exactly small. However, after some thought, he decided that these wise ones must have had their reasons, so he didn't press further. "All right, we'll head back to the Fang residence first," he said with a nod. And then they were off. All right, everyone, that concludes the reading of Copper Coins Volume 2 by Musu-Lee. I hope you all thoroughly enjoyed this series so far, especially Volume 2. Please let me know your thoughts and reactions in the comment section. Of course, this is a side read, so I'm not really sharing my thoughts and reactions and all that kind of stuff. But one thing I will say is Chapter 27, page 307. Finally have a favorite quote. And that is going to be, "Dying without remorse or understanding of one's wrongdoings was a form of release. It was more fitting to be denied that and to die full of guilt and fear." I thought that line was boss. Anyway, that's pretty much it. Like I said, please let me know your thoughts and all of those things in the comment section. As a reminder, this is a 3-volume series. Volume 3 will be released April 21st of this year. So when that is released, I will buy it and I'll start recording it slowly and get those out to you as soon as possible. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great day and or night. I'll see you all next time, and Wa-ai-Ni-Men.